Alaikum, brother Asadullah Ali al Andalusi.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. How are you?
Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. Um, we are here to talk about one of the most pertinent issue of the world today. That is ISIS. But before we get into the crux, why don't you share something about yourself with everybody here at first? A bit of a background would be nice.
All right. Well, I'm currently broadcasting in Malaysia, where I live. However, I hail from the United States. I was born and raised there. Although my family originates from Spain, I was born into a Catholic family, reverted to Islam in 2008 in Chicago, and then came over to Malaysia to study Islam, Islamic philosophy, Islamic thought. And yeah, ever since then, I've been here.
So I heard that your PhD is more related to ISIS. Would you say a word or two about that? What are you doing?
My PhD studies in Islamic studies at the University of Malaya. I'm studying particularly extremism and liberalism in the Muslim world, with emphasis as a case study on ISIS. My PhD thesis is actually called ISIS, or the delusional state of ISIS. And it's about kind of where their thought process is coming from, how they have come up with this idea of an Islamic state and their actions in accordance with the Sharia and things like this. So.
Okay, so you are probably the most pertinent guy to talk about this, a very important topic. So let's get down to business. So if we look at the people who are traveling to Syria at present or joining ISIS, we would see that it's the demography is like 20 to 40, if you may. So it's on a very younger spectrum of people that are joining. Why do you think this is the case? What causes this? What causes these people to go into scenarios which is essentially suicide?
Well, first off, we need to understand why young people are actually going there. Most people will just say it is because, when you're young, you're foolish, and that's part of it, but it's not the main factor. There are numerous factors as to why younger individuals are joining ISIS, and it has a lot to do with the time and place in which they are in and the societies in which they come from. So if we look at the first factor, I would say the type of societies. You find a lot of these young men are coming from not only the Western world, which is predominantly secular and liberal, but also many places in the Arab world, which are also secular and liberal. That's why you find a lot of young men coming from Syria and Iraq, which contrary to popular opinion, are not exactly Islamic societies. I mean, in Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, obviously they were very secular. Bashar al-Assad, you don't have to argue about that.
There is no reason to argue about that.
Yeah. And when you live in a secular liberal society, so particular ideologies that you were sort of indoctrinated with at a young age, or even still, are within the population as a whole, that's why you have a lot of people in these regions and these particular places having sympathy for ISIS in some degree. And also you have sort of the downgrading of Islamic education, because secular liberal societies are naturally separate religion or opposed to religion. So you have very sort of watered down understanding of Islam, and also of the importance of the scholars. So that's the first factor. We can get into more detail with that later. The second factor regarding their youth is that they're coming in. They are born. These individuals are born in a time where the Muslim world is in chaos.
Total chaos.
Yeah, total chaos. There's war everywhere around them. All they see is this. So for a lot of young men and women who are actively engaged in conflict, even prior to joining ISIS, this is sort of the world that they already understand. So for them, it's not really anything different.
Sure.
From what they're used to.
So that's the paradigm that they're living in, more or less.
Yeah. Now, why you don't see the older people, for instance, joining ISIS has a lot to do with their past. The fact that they have seen their own parents. So they are imbued with a different sort of values and understanding of the world, that is still connected to traditional scholarship, whereas the youth, they've been completely disconnected.
That's an interesting take. So you're basically saying that it's the lack of basically a vacuum of knowledge of Islam that propels one to ISIS rather than being overzealous in the first place. So the one of the main, I mean, of course there would be an overzealousness, but that's caused by the vacuum of knowledge of Islam.
That's one of the causes, because when you have a vacuum, it's not just that. We have to understand that we have a lot of people saying, well, they lack knowledge of Islam. That's true. But when you lack something, you have to fill it with something else, right?
Something else, yeah.
So the alternative that's also motivating them. When you have a lack of Islam, you have something in its place. So what is it that is motivating them? A lack of something doesn't motivate anybody to do anything.
True.
It's like when atheists say, well, we hate religion because we're atheists. No, you don't. for reasons other than your lack of belief in God.
Yeah, there should be a positive belief which propels them to do something. Yeah.
Exactly. So there's these certain liberal beliefs that these guys are holding, which propound them to go to Syria and Iraq and fight. It's very little to do with religion, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But the specific beliefs within liberalism that kind of give this this impression that one has to fight or one has to join a cause that is very much militarily bound or bound towards violence has a lot to do with liberalism itself, has a lot to do with liberalism's history, has a lot to do with secular society's history. There is not one secular society in this world that in the past 200 years has not been engaged in some sort of massive conflict, or is still not engaged in some sort of massive conflict. It doesn't have ideology that is about military struggle, domination of its enemies. And a lot of it has to do with the universal understanding that, of a universal imposed morality, like the
Geneva Conventions and so on and so forth.
Yeah, human rights and things like this. And then you have also this idea that only one law should be above everyone. One law. So, which is, by the way, against Islamic understanding. Because we believe the Sharia is the best law. It's only meant for Muslims.
Encompasses different halakats of laws. Yeah.
Exactly. So, I mean, for the liberal West, this has been sort of the paradigm. So you can't be surprised when young men coming from these societies act the same way.
So it's groomed. It's more like they are groomed from the beginning to have a certain worldview, which basically acts as some kind of a breeding ground later on.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, the West and Western ideology breeds extremism, not simply because of its imposition of its values on the people who don't want them, but also because of its inability to be tolerant towards foreign societies or foreign values. Even though it says it's tolerant, all it really means is that it tries to water down whatever comes into its sphere.
And you have to integrate.
Yeah, you have to integrate to so-called British American values that nobody can ever define. So it's sort of ingrained in them. And then you say, well, then why are these secular societies so peaceful domestically? Well, they're not. Anybody who look at the studies, will know that clearly societies are very much in turmoil, domestically speaking. I mean, yeah, you can compare it to Syria and Iraq, of course. There's a civil war going on. That's not fair. But when you have a state of security and yet homicide rates are higher in secular society, that's something.
That's true.
And not only that, but you still have a lot of racism, you still have a lot of nationalism, and these things weren't. I mean, we had them to an extent within Muslim majority societies during the Ottoman Empire and before that, but not to the extreme that we have them now. Ranting, sorry.
No problem. There's another drive that I've seen in the young people. At least I'm not sure that they went into ISIS, but there is something innate that they speak about. The thing that they speak about is we have to establish the Khilafah. And that ISIS, when they came over, one of the biggest punchline was we have established the Khilafah, and that basically caused a massive exodus into the ISIS, if you may, ISIS territory, if you may. So, what are the what are the mandates? And if you check the U.S. newscasts, this has become something like a boogeyman. Oh, he's there to establish Sharia, to establish Khilafah. So what is establishing the Khilafah, and like, is it obligatory, and how is ISIS way of establishing it does it make sense, or can you elucidate on that?
This is a very big discussion, but be as concise as possible. Establishing the Khilafah is obligatory for the Muslim community, the Ummah in general. It's something that we should be striving for. And it's not an obsolete idea to think this way. I mean, you have to remember, we've only lost the Khilafah, what, 100 years ago?
About 100 years ago. Not even 100 years, 1924, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's the idea that somehow this is an outdated opinion or an outdated viewpoint when we were on the Khilafah for what, 1,300 years.
Proud about that.
You know, it's like, that for me is kind of irrational, very silly thing to say. So yes, to establish a Khilafah is obviously obligatory. Now, of course, we argue about how that's supposed to be done, in which way it's supposed to be done. And before getting into the specifics of that, I want to mention that one of the motivating factors, yes, behind sort of these foolish youth saying, oh, yes, ISIS is valid because they've established the Khilafah, whatever. Well, you know, they don't know their own history, because there have been many groups in the past that have said they've established the Khilafah.
That's true.
A lot of reasons that many youth did not join them back then was because there was another Khilafah already in place that was vying for that power, and there was a struggle there. Now you don't have any alternatives, so in their mind, it's like, oh, this must be the Khilafah because it's the only Khilafah. Well, you know, if you look back in your history, it's not really that special. A lot of deviant groups have tried to establish it before in times of chaos, and you know, there have been multiple Khilafahs fighting each other at some points in history until one, you know, rose to be victorious. So this idea, this motivation, I can understand it, because they're looking at ISIS and they're going, oh, these guys are the only ones doing it, so therefore it must be
true.
Halas, it must be, you know, on the haq. You know what I mean? And you know, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi must be the, you know, Khalifa because
his name is yes, and his name is Abu Bakr, the first Khalifa. So why not?
And, you know, he's got a big beard, and alhamdulillah, and it's like, you know, but you know, it's not surprising, because the Prophet ﷺ had sort of already, not sort of, but he already predicted this was going to occur in many authentic hadith, and people like to look at this kind of literally, these hadith very literally, and they don't really see what's being said. But when he says that these individuals, and he's talking about the Khariji, the Khawarij in general here, he's talking about, when you look at these people, they're going to recite the Quran better than you, they're going to pray better than you, they're going to do all sorts of things, but they leave the religion like an arrow leaves its prey, right?
Just for the information, the Khawarij, the best translation would be for the English-speaking audience, it would be something like a renegade, right?
It's a very, yeah, I mean, renegade would probably be the best way to put it, but not renegade simply in the sense of militarily. We have to understand renegade in the sense of all aspects of Islam.
Right.
And actually, specifically, it was initially used in reference to the scholars, as in renegades against the scholarly community. And we'll get into that later as well, because ISIS, when they look at these hadith, they try to interpret them so literally and only historically to make themselves no longer under this prophecy. They'll say like, oh no, it just means that, you know, we can't be Khawarij because we love Ali. The Khawarij hated Ali. It's like, no, that's not the point. Ali and Ibn Abbas and all of these brothers, the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, right? All of them were scholarly class. Okay, the Khawarij were not. They didn't hate Ali. That wasn't the point. Yes, of course they hated Ali, but they didn't hate Ali because he was Ali. They hated Ali because of other reasons regarding his knowledge, regarding his understanding of the Sunnah, regarding his understanding of the Quran.
Because basically they hated the value that he stood for, and he happened to be the centerpiece
of the class.
Yes,
that's what they hate. That's what they're opposed to. And you find ISIS is the same way, because none of the scholars are with them at all. I mean, all of the scholars oppose them.
Okay, so might I proceed, or
No, I went on a rant.
Okay, no
So there was
problem.
in
So
a
no
second.
problem, no problem. There's this fringe idea, not exactly. I wouldn't say it's a fringe. Maybe people don't want. Maybe it's not popular in the social media, but I've kind of heard this idea that okay, maybe ISIS has a lot of fault and things like that. So why don't we get inside and make it better from inside? You know, just go inside because it's already kind of getting established. So just it's already in the germinal stage, if you may. So make it better or something like that. So
Well,
what do
that's
you
the problem
see?
first. I mean, you have to first determine whether ISIS is legitimate in order to make them better. And the thing is, they're not legitimate, and there are many reasons as to why. And I mentioned them in brief.
Some of them.
One of them was the fact that they're opposed to the scholarly class. You cannot establish a state or an Islamic polity without the scholarly class being behind you, and even the Khalifa has to have certain requirements. The Khalifa himself, they tried to say that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi he fulfills all the requirements. He's from the Quraysh, and he has ijazah. He doesn't even have an ijazah.
He doesn't.
No, he has a PhD in Islamic studies. What I'm getting from
Right.
Baghdad University, which is not saying much. And I mean, I'm not trying to bash my own education here, but there's a big difference between having an academic degree
Hmm.
and having an ijazah or
That's true.
and he does not have one. He is a PhD in Islamic studies, and maybe he's from the Quraysh, even though we haven't even gotten any sort of
Tapestry or anything like that.
any sort of any actual affirmation of that. We have claims of it, but um, even if that were the case, if he does, it doesn't make him legitimate.
Mhm.
There are other reasons why it's not legitimate. For example, the fact of the matter is that they established themselves within a area of utter chaos. Okay, and then they said, okay, we have this territory. Well, what are you talking about? Because you have how many factions are in Iraq and Syria right now?
Myriads.
Myriads, more than you can count. They're all vying for power. ISIS, whatever territory it claims to have, loses it or gains it back in like matter of days. I mean, you don't even know where ISIS is. I mean, like half the time. They say, well, our capital is here. Well, that's nice, but then you lose like half of it, and then you get another half back again. It's like people are not in a state of security.
It's like bitcoins.
Yeah, they have not established a Sharia, actually even improperly. They say they've established a Sharia. What do you mean you've established a Sharia? In what way have you established a Sharia? Oh, you're practicing the Hadud. Okay, alhamdulillah, you're doing that. But then what else are you doing? What else have you done? And they can't really answer that. Most of the time, they say, well, we've applied the appropriate taxes, we've applied the jizya, we've applied this. Okay, but yet still, the Muslims under your polity are in constant threat. They barely have access to food and water. They barely have appropriate economy. Your entire economy is based on stealing from Iraqi oil, and
Well,
you don't even have your own industry. In the very least, when the Khilafah was started during the time of Abu Bakr, you know, um, they had some things. They had secure, not only secure cities, but they had industry. Not comparable today, obviously. They had farming. They had a massive amount of land to be country, and uh, they had to protect their borders, obviously. But it's like ISIS doesn't even have any borders. They have nothing to call their own. Everything they keep acquiring is taken from their enemy, but they can never actually keep it for more than like a month. I'm just saying it's not a secure area. It's not a secure location.
so,
When your own Khalifa can't even walk the streets without.
so it's more like a how should I say it? It's more like a transient state. Things are just coming in and going out, and more like an influx of things that are happening, and not even a safe thing for people to travel to or for that.
Basically, here's another thing that I like to challenge a lot of these ISIS supporters with.
Sure.
What's stopping somebody else from getting up and saying, "I'm the Khalifa"?
That's true. If he claimed for this, if he claims that he has the same qualifications, for example, coming from Quraysh and has a PhD in Islamic studies, I have no idea. I think
Land, and if he decides, I'm just gonna take over,
another land and maybe
what's
my village, and
what's
then
stopping him from doing that? And and then he gets, like, say he gets another half of the population to join him, then you have like even more chaos. The one of the great things about the Khalifas of the past and the Khilafah in general is that even though we had these periods of transition and we had, like when the Abbasids took over after the Umayyads, and you had that civil war and stuff. However, the structure, the actual, the territory, things like this, that stayed, for the most part, very stable. You didn't have complete chaos throughout the region, and whole societies being ripped apart, and refugees going everywhere, or you had an amount of stability where that transition did not affect everyone to such a degree, or it completely caused mass
just
chaos.
mhm.
But
Yeah,
now you do.
yeah, that's true. That's true. So I would actually like to see an ISIS supporter answer that one. That's an interesting question.
Well, they have these. What they do, they always do these very evasive answers.
Maneuvers.
They tried to say, well, this happened in the past, and we're just having a kind of a problem right now, and we'll get up to speed again. And I'm like, you weren't even up to speed to begin with.
That's true.
Uh,
That's true. So it's more like a catch-22.
yeah.
But let's talk about the actions that ISIS is causing to the West. As much as it's doing the damage or fighting in Syria, it's also causing things like the France massacres and Belgium massacres. And one of the way that I've seen that this is justified is because they say that, well, um, things like Guantanamo Bay is there, and then there was war on terror, and we are being massacred, and then Muslims were being killed. So it gives us some kind of right to go into their society and then do the same thing to their civilians. While I understand some kind of a zeal behind it, I mean, I wouldn't be able to recognize that value, but I can understand that value to some extent. That if we are being hurt, we would like to hurt you. But what is the Islamic say on what does Islam say on that?
Well, I gave a lecture on this not too long ago in regards to at least one of the main reasons that they think this is justifiable, and it actually comes from some of the luminaries' interpretations of the Quran, their understanding of some of the ayahs of the Quran. And there's two specific ayahs that they focus on when they try to justify acts of terrorism in the West. First off, I just want to say this, is that obviously Western military and government and even some of its people have done considerable amount of damage to the Muslim world, and they should be held accountable for that. However, going into random crowds and random buildings and blowing yourself up and killing people, aside from the problem of suicide there, but killing just random people because you think it's okay, to me this is very problematic. And it simply justifies what the West is doing. And so the two
That's true.
ayahs that they tried to use in support of this are the following. And first, Surah Al-Baqarah 194, they say, fighting in the sacred month is for aggression committed in the sacred month, and for all violations, legal retribution. So whoever has assaulted you, then assault him in the same way that he has assaulted you. So they take this ayah and very generally saying that, well, the way they've attacked us, so they kill our civilians, so we're allowed to kill theirs. Okay. Then they use another ayah of the Quran, Surah 16, 126. They say, and if you punish an enemy, punish with an equivalent of that which you were harmed. But if you are patient, is better for those who are patient. So they use this also to justify killing civilians because their civilians have been killed. Now, there's a massive problem with interpreting it in this fashion, because and Osama bin Laden actually interpreted it in this fashion, and they use him, they quote him often to also justify attacking civilians in the West. And the problem is this, is that when you say that, okay, Western military has killed my family, so say my family,
All right.
I
That's
am
good.
justified in killing that soldier's family or whoever else randomly is laying on the street or walking around, This is problematic because it assumes that you are the victim. So you killed my family, so I am the victim now. So now I can hurt you in the same way you hurt me. But the problem is that you are not the victim. Your family was the victim. They're the ones who got killed. So the person who should be killed, the only people who should actually be complaining, well, they can't because they're dead, but are them against the person who killed them. So that person who murdered them needs to be the one who's punished, not his family, because his family didn't do anything. And so this is a very egotistical interpretation, and it actually comes from a liberal mindset of individualism, because it assumes, well, you killed my family, so now I am the victim, I am feeling bad, so now I'm going to make you feel bad. It's like, no, this is stupid, it's selfish, and it has nothing to do with the Quran, or even what the Quran is trying to say.
I don't really think that the Quran I don't really think that you can stretch those verses up to that standard, because the verses that you quoted is saying that do the same kind of damage, do the damage to the same degree. Now, let's say, for example, if somebody came and raped your family, Islam by no means would justify you to rape the perpetrator's family. That is not the way that Islam would
exactly. But the
function.
Interpret it. This is actually their logic. And this is the problem, too, is that they have a very individualistic, very egotistical understanding of these ayahs. They don't even understand them in the context in which they were revealed. Because if you see the time of the Prophet ﷺ, you know, his family was targeted, his companions were targeted. Did he go into Mecca and start, you know, killing random people of other family members because, you know, no. I mean, even if he wanted to revenge, the appropriate revenge, he would have killed the
perpetrators
did those things, not their families. And so they don't even, not only do they not understand the Quran or the Mufassirun who reveal the understanding behind it, but they don't even understand the seerah of the Prophet. They haven't even read, it's like they haven't even read the seerah.
That's true. Like, I think there was a report that came out that the majority of the young people were going outside to join ISIS. They're buying things like basic Islamic books to just get acquainted with Islam. So yeah. I think there are some truth behind it. We don't know how much, but there's some truth behind it, maybe.
There's a lot of truth behind it. You know, I think if they're buying Islam for dummies, then it's obvious that they don't have legitimate scholars within so-called ISIS that can help to teach them and educate them properly on what Islam actually is. Mm-hmm. So that's another issue. And do you see any of the major scholars not only joining ISIS, but even perpetuating or justifying any of these acts whatsoever? No. So those are two major problems here that reveal the ignorance even within their own borders. I mean, if they had, like I said, if they had legitimate scholars, why are these guys buying books of such low caliber, you know, to understand the religion?
Which is even interesting, is because even though Al Qaeda and ISIS are basically brothers from different mothers or something like that, yeah. But even the scholars of Al Qaeda, I believe that they have even pronounced Ridda or something like that, or pronounced that ISIS have gone some kind of deviance. Even though Al Qaeda themselves, they have their own kind of very close interpretations, but ISIS have gone so far out off the ledge that even Al Qaeda was forced to say that, well, we don't identify ISIS anymore. We don't identify with ISIS anymore.
Of course they do. The only thing is that they're not the ones in power.
Yeah.
So that's the problem. You know, it's because ISIS is doing something different from them. You know, it's because they're not the ones, you know, with the legitimacy now.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, of course. Like I said, they are basically brothers from different mothers. They have almost the same thing, that just different clothes. They do the same thing under different turbans and under different clothes.
I want to mention one more thing too. There's a second reason there's a second
please
justification for killing civilians. They often will say that, well, the nature of democracy means that, and the nature of taxation within secular liberal societies means that because regular civilians give money to the military and vote for politicians into power who cause all these wars, therefore they are liable to be punished.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's one of the...
This is also not legitimate, because our scholars have differentiated between willfully doing so, as in, like, you know, here, I'm going to give you money to go kill these people, and, you know, and people who are just forced or ignorant of the society they're living in, don't know what's going on, you know. And for the most part, most people in the West are on the latter. You know, they're on the other side. You know, they don't really know what's going on, or they don't really have a choice in the matter. And if they did have a choice, if they wanted to rebel, you know, they'd end up killing themselves in the process, and their whole society would crumble. And so it's not like they have an easy choice here. Um, do I think that more people in the West should do more? Yeah, but do I think that it's like an easy choice for them? Not so much. And I don't think they deserve to be bombed by some random guy from Syria or Iraq just because they they're having difficulty.
And
In
and like you said, this kind of action gives more legitimacy for even more interventions, even more drone attacks and things like that. And for the Muslims who are living in the West, this just becomes more like a hellish place, because everybody is just a potential ISIS or something like that. Because if some bomb goes out somewhere, people would become suspicious of anybody with a beard or something like that.
It's giving into what ISIS wants. It also gives into what the West wants. See, they
Yeah.
can help each other because they're actually part of the same ideology.
Yeah, they scratch off each other's back as they go on.
They just have different masks.
Yeah, that's true. Since you are from Muslim Debate Initiative and you have had decent debates, very enlightening debates, I'm sure you're not alien or ignorant of the name David Woods and Robert Spencer. I think I don't really think you don't need to be a person from Muslim Debate Initiative to know these clowns. One of the interesting, or not so interesting, statement that came out from these people like Nabil Qureshi or David Wood or Robert Spencer is, if Prophet ﷺ lived in this time and era, he wouldn't be joining ISIS. He would be basically leading ISIS. What do you have? What would you say to this kind of ignorant and very irresponsible claims, which basically alienates even the Western Muslims?
Well, they have a lot of. I mean, there's a lot of nonsense behind that statement that would take far longer than this interview to elucidate. But I will say this: that obviously I disagree with it because I think that anyone who has actually read even just a basic biography of the Prophet would notice that ISIS is completely contrary to this understanding that we're having not only with Islamophobes but with these extremists. Some of the main examples they'll use is how the Prophet treated, some prisoners of war. And they only pick, they cherry pick certain things. They don't ever actually look at the whole picture.
I think the method of ISIS and these guys are very similar. I don't really think that they even seek to differentiate between the Islamic study that these two groups do. I mean, they come into the same conclusion following the same methods. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, because like I said, they come from a very similar ideology. I mentioned earlier in this discussion that a lot of these young men coming from secular liberal societies where they have an understanding of one law for all, they have an understanding of justice that's very different from traditional Islam. They have an understanding of their enemies that's very different from Islam and the way how the enemy should be attacked. So when you're from this sort of society, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to take those biases and you're going to impose them on what you're reading. So, for instance, when Robert Spencer or somebody from ISIS reads the Sirah, what they're already doing is projecting their own lifestyle, their own understanding of things onto the text. And they're kind of just ignoring some of the things that seem anomalous or, contradictory to that understanding. Or they're just sort of, making excuses for, oh, you must have had to do this at this time because of some, random reason that, So they will never actually be able to take the text holistically. More than anything, liberals and the extremist liberals like ISIS cherry pick beyond belief because their worldview doesn't allow them to look at things holistically.
Okay, there's this kind of phrase that has been floating around in the internet. Maybe not that much, but it caught my eye, so I wanted to see your comment behind it. What would you say? Is it the radicalization of Islam or Islamization of the radicals? What would be the proper phrase that is describing this ISIS phenomena?
Well, I wouldn't call either of them. I don't like the term radicalization in general. I think that it's an appropriate term because you can only be a radical outside the borders of a particular perspective or interpretation. So when you say Islamic radical, what does that even mean? Especially in context of a secular liberal society. If you're radical within a liberal society, it means you're not liberal. But if you're radical in Islamic society, then it means that you are a liberal. So I think these are just confusing terms, and they're used in very different ways for very different people. I think the best way to describe what we're seeing is obviously extremism, but what we're seeing is extremism um, outside the bounds of the Sharia, but not outside the bounds of liberalism.
Uh-huh.
I see there's nothing extreme about, and this may be very controversial, I see nothing extreme about what these guys are doing in liberal societies, because I see liberals doing in them all the time. In other societies, if they're coming in blowing themselves up and killing innocent civilians, this is not very different than how liberal societies treat other nations. So I don't really see much of a difference. There's nothing extreme about their actions. It's just happening to them, so they're complaining. But for Muslims, this is very extreme behavior. And this is how we should see it. For us, it is extreme. It is extreme. It is outside the bounds of Sharia. It's outside the bounds of Islam. And that's how we should see it. Obviously, the appropriate term in a legal context would be hiraba.
Hiraba.
And we should really look at it like that if we want to be specific.
Mm-hmm.
Because these terms are very loaded these days: extremism, radicalism, fundamentalism.
It comes with a certain paradigm behind it, and
it's all anti-religious.
That's true. We're almost on the finishing of this interview. I mean, I've taken a long time of your busy schedule. Thank you for coming on live with me. But before we end, what would if I want you to say something like, what would you tell to a young person who's contemplating to joining ISIS? And I know that there are many who are contemplating to join ISIS from time to time. Maybe it's because of some drone attack that see. Maybe it's because they see that Saudis or other government are some kind of sellouts and things like that. All of these arguments that are being rehearsed over and over again in social media and in young people. If you have like maybe 30 seconds or 1 minute to say just something to the young people that are contemplating, maybe not going, or contemplating maybe 50-50 here and there, what would you like to say to them?
I would say this. I would say, look at the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, read his seerah, reflect on his seerah as much as you reflect on the Quran, if you reflect on the Quran. But if you don't do that, reflect on the seerah as much as possible and look at the differences. How did the Prophet ﷺ deal with oppression? How did he deal with persecution? When he was in Mecca and his companions were being killed, persecuted, and run out, did he pick up a sword in the first moment, run into a crowd and say Allahu Akbar and start slashing at everyone? Or did he continue to preach? Did he continue to do jihad with his tongue, then move his companions and himself outside, make hijrah, establish himself in a more secure location, then form an army, form a proper society, and then come back and fight? That would be my response. And I think it's a rhetorical question, because the obvious answer is that nothing ISIS is doing is what the Prophet ﷺ did.
Even the initial wars, like Badr battle of Uhud and so on and so forth, they were more of a defensive war. So it wasn't even like he just established a military like you do in RPG game, and then you take some army and then go and attack the opposite tavern or something like that. So
we have tradition of conquest. Yes, we do have tradition of offensive warfare, but there are so many limitations and restrictions to that. And the thing is that the Prophet ﷺ was patient under persecution and oppression, and he was patient not because patience itself is a virtue without any sort of value. He was patient because he was also had to be very strategic. He had to be responsible in his behavior. He had to be intelligent about his response. He can't just we have these young men running into caves with AK-47 saying they can take on the most powerful army in the world because Allah is on their side. I'm sorry, no. The Prophet ﷺ was not. He was supported by Allah the whole time, but Allah also wanted him to be wise. He wanted him to be careful. He wanted him to be considerate of all the factors involved. And you don't see ISIS doing any of this. You see them rushing into everything, establishing a khilafah before anything is even, when the Prophet went to Hijrah, and his companions with the Hijrah, they went into safety, into security. And now ISIS is calling people to come to Hijrah, into chaos and conflict and destruction. Complete opposite
Opposite.
of the Sirah.
Diametrically opposite.
So the fact that they think they're following the Sunnah, I tell these young people, please think. Really, what is the Sunnah? What did the Prophet ﷺ actually do? What would he want to do? And if you're going to say he's going to lead ISIS, if the Islamophobes and ISIS, because I've heard ISIS
Same thing.
preachers saying this, which, by the way, is, as far as I'm concerned, is apostasy. Because if you say that, never mind my whole entire idea about ISIS in general. I actually do think they're apostates, but that's if you want, we can discuss that. But the fact that you have the audacity to say that when you're doing completely opposite of what the Prophet ﷺ did in his lifetime, to me is beyond mental. It's beyond mental. It's like, how dare you even insult not only the Prophet ﷺ's legacy, and you insult his character, you insult him, which is the worst thing, but you're insulting the intelligence of every Muslim in the world, including your own, to even suggest such a ridiculous assumption. So I'm sorry to be so harsh in that respect, but I want these kids to wake up. Look, I understand how you feel. And this is not a 30-second response, but I understand how you feel, but your feelings do not dictate what should happen. Those are your nafs that need to be controlled. What dictates what should happen is what the Prophet ﷺ did. And I promise you, he did not follow his feelings. So please consider that for a moment before you decide to run off and do something
stupid.
Yeah.
Brother Asadullah Ali al Andalusi, thank you very much for your time, and maybe inshallah in future we will have even more lively discussion with different topics with you, and even maybe something about philosophy and things like that. I would love to have that kind of conversation with you inshallah in future, but for now I think we should end this without prolonging it for too long, inshallah. I hope that the people who have listened to that in any way, shape or form have benefited from it.